Microsoft Copilot was a huge failure. Why did this happen, and what lessons can be learned? Welcome to Dave Linthicum is Not AI. I'm Dave, an AI SME and an AI skeptic, looking at AI with a balanced perspective. Let's get started. So the reason I made this video is because there was a lot of backlash on Microsoft Copilot, around the launch, and then of course forcing it into Windows 11 and then removing support for Windows 10, where people felt it was forced upon them, things like that. And I think it's good to look at why this system, this AI system that Microsoft was selling, they made systemic to their operating system and their productivity tools, just was not liked. So much not liked, it was hated. And I've never seen a backlash like this with any sub products that anybody has put out, and specifically Microsoft. I guess there was Clippy from, 10 years ago, things like that. People hated that. Microsoft pulled it back, but people just have a disdain for Copilot. And I'd like to talk about why that is and what actually happened here. So Copilot launched with an everyday AI companion, or basically being promoted as that promised to set expectations extremely high. And Microsoft framed Copilot as a broad daily assistant across Windows and Microsoft experiences, I guess all their productivity tools. So users expected a step change in productivity right away. And when the day-to-day experience didn't match the marketing, disappointment was immediate. So I didn't really pay much attention to it when this was launched, but it started to appear on my Microsoft tools. I've been a Microsoft, Office user forever, and now Microsoft 365. And suddenly I had Copilot there. Well, what is that? And what is it good for? And, the times that I did use it, I felt it was, ill-planned, wasn't functional. And quite frankly, created some concerns, some privacy issues, things like that. Obviously, I do everything within my Microsoft tools. I'm not saying they were spying on me, but there was another potential because you had this thing that was reaching out over the internet to communicate with a backend LLM, and that was of concern to me. And the other thing is, I'm along, thinking like everybody else. There's a huge amount of AI fatigue that's out there. AI is everywhere. It's systemic to every tool, every piece of software that you use, whether it's on your phone or on your PC or even your TV. And this was another AI LLM that was probably working just like the other LLMs. And not sure I really needed it. I would rather go out and, launch ChatGPT or, Gemini or, even some of the other LLMs that are out there and use it directly versus having it embedded, in my productivity tools. So I had kind of this visceral reaction when I saw it. Said, why is it there? I guess I'm probably paying for it. And I guess that turns out to be the case. And I just had a negative feeling. I didn't like it. And I kind of had the same feeling that most people felt out there when they saw Copilot for the first time, that was embedded into their Windows environments or embedded into their Microsoft productivity tools. So the rollout method made it feel unavoidable. It arrived as part of a Windows update. Instead of being just another app, Copilot began rolling out through Windows 11 updates starting in September 26, 2003, putting it directly into the core OS experience and in front of people who weren't asking for it. Now, I didn't experience that. Use the Apple tools and Linux, and typically I'm a Unix guy from way back. So I don't have a Windows machine. I think I had a Windows machine sitting on the shelf that I would use for, to evaluate some software that couldn't run on other platforms. But I didn't see that, but I can see how that would be annoying, because suddenly you're getting an operating system update you didn't ask for. And there's these AI tools that are embedded into the operating system that you also didn't ask for. And they're making you pay for it. In other words, it's going to be an upgrade. By the way, we're giving you this AI, and that's going to be built into the price of the licensing, what to pay for if you're buying a PC, things like that. And the big thing, which is what many users I've heard felt really strongly about, is the fact of the matter is it's going to be a forced upgrade. So in other words, if you're running Windows 10, which didn't have Copilot on it, they're eventually going to force you to Windows 11. Now, sometimes Windows 11 required a hardware update, so you had to go out and buy a new PC. So if you're a Windows user, you're going to kind of get screwed either way. And when you upgrade to Windows 11, finally, the Copilot stuff comes along that's systemic to everything. And it just seemed like Microsoft was making another one of their mistakes, where they're coming up with something that they feel is brilliant and forcing it down everybody's throats. So Copilot tried to be everywhere at once, Windows browsers, search, apps, which magnified the friction I think people were feeling. So by spreading Copilot across multiple surfaces early, any rough edges, confusing, UXs, uneven usefulness, things like that showed up and in more places. And so complaints stacked up quickly. And this is when I started to hear about it. So it wasn't around the launch time. I think people said, here we go, another, AI feature, whoop-de-doo. It was the fact of the matter is that Microsoft was trying to use their leverage in the market to get Copilot front and center of everybody out there. It had no additional capabilities than some of the other LLMs out there. I'm sure it's perfectly fine for doing some of the minor stuff and rewriting sentences and all the stuff we're using LLMs for already. But just the fact of the matter is you couldn't get away from it. You bring up Microsoft Excel, Copilot's there. You bring up Word, Copilot's there. You bring up PowerPoint, Copilot's there. And I understand why they viewed it as something that's going to be useful if it's systemic to everything you use in your productivity environment. But at the end of the day, I don't think anybody asked for it. I don't think that any of the Windows and Microsoft productivity users were screaming about having AI embedded, into these features. And it just felt forced. And I think that caused much of the negative reaction. So we don't like as human beings to have things forced upon us. We want to make a choice. And also we don't want to feel like we're paying for something that we're not getting value from. The majority of people who have Copilot on their systems, including me, it's running in front of me right now. I can go to other sources and typically free sources and do everything I can do within Copilot, and it's going to work just as well, if not better. And I'm making that choice to do it versus having something that is forced into every bit of the ecosystem that I'm using. And of course, this is everywhere. I'm not just blaming Microsoft. Obviously, bring up a iPhone application, or you bring up an application on the Mac that's running in front of me here. It's going to have AI that's going to be systemic to all these, basic features, even my, fitness applications, things like that. Everything, AIs are going to be around. And people are getting sick of it. I think Microsoft was becoming the scapegoat for that because they were the worst at pushing this at everybody who didn't ask for it. And so people are feeling a little gypped out there. The whole AI stuff, it's helpful, but we don't need as much of it as we're seeing. And I think people are, quite frankly, pushing back against it. And this is another instance of that. So then users pushed back because it felt like, push marketing, not user choice. Key drivers of the backlash was the perception that Copilot was being inserted into workflows rather than pulled in when needed, turning an assistant into an annoyance for many people. So I found that it inserted itself into many of my processes, writing a document, writing a PowerPoint presentation, things like that, when I didn't ask for it and I didn't need it. And that's what I think felt intrusive. And I think that people react negatively to that. Microsoft, I'm sure in their R&D and the product manager, of the operating systems and the productivity teams, things like that, thought they were absolutely genius in the fact they're going to make AI systemic to everything. And it's going to be a helpful tool that's able to span these operating systems and productivity tools and make everybody's life better. And it's going to be an attractive feature that's going to lock people into the Microsoft ecosystem. And it backfired because they weren't thinking properly. They weren't thinking like humans. In order for humans to be productive with this technology, they need to choose it, and they need to trust it, and they need to understand it. And none of those steps were taken by Microsoft, just like everything else I think they've done many times in the last 35 years I've been working with them. They'll just push it at you and make you pay for it. And since it's part of an operating system, a part of productivity tools you absolutely depend on, you really feel like you have no choice. So trust became, part of the story, not just features. One of the conversations, shifts to, should I trust this on my operating system? It stops from being normal product debate. The trust angle intensified resistance and made just ignore it an unacceptable answer for some users. The core thing that I heard is that it was, as people were analyzing it, it was doing some things that felt that it violated the trust. There was some, taking screenshots and things like that. Not sure what apparatus was involved with that, but I did hear about that and did read about that. And people are very sensitive about that, private information. I'm very sensitive about it. Last thing I want to have happen and have any data or information transmitted outside of my own ecosystem, this computer in my network, that I didn't authorize. And if they're sending data to some sort of a back-end system, which I know many of these applications are doing, that's going to be concerning to me. And so I have to obviously sign into Microsoft 365 to use their tools. They know who I am. They know my profile. And if they're reading my conversations with LLMs, or they're reading, my keystrokes or whatever, I'm not saying they are, but if they're doing something like that, and I have just a whiff of that, I'm not going to trust them. And I think that's what happened here. People saw enough issues with Copilot security, whether true or not, or perceived or not, that they frankly pushed back on it. So the practical value wasn't obvious enough for average users to forgive the disruption. So if an AI feature doesn't quickly and clearly save time without extra checking, people label it as noise, the benefit versus hassle calculation, and the adoption stalled. So not only did people push back on this, but they pushed back hard. There's a whole culture of folks that are here on YouTube and, out there, I'm sure on Reddit and other areas, that are just very mad about this. And the fact of the matter is that they didn't ask for it, they didn't want it, and they may have had to use Windows, which is going to be part of their job. In other words, they're given a laptop, and they're not saying, here's your laptop from your employer, and it's going to have, Linux on it. It's going to have typically Windows on it, and they're going to control it, and they're going to give you the tool sets. And suddenly this stuff felt very forced. And so people pushed back on it in a visceral way. For some reason, operating systems, productivity tools are kind of optional. I can use different word processors and different presentation, systems if I have to, but operating systems are typically going to be systemic to everything you use. And people felt that it's almost a sacred thing, a violation of ethics if they're pushing stuff at you didn't ask for. And Microsoft has a whole history of doing that, and this is no different here. And so what was interesting to me was not that someone pushed back on it, but the number of people who pushed back and the force that they pushed back, because these guys were mad. And I'm sure many of you who are watching this video, were part of that little mini culture that's still going on today. And looking at the complaints and looking at the reasons behind it, probably for good reason, because there's distrust. They felt gypped. They're having to pay for extra things, upgrading their, laptops. Those are things are, $1,000 to $2,000 these days. And then feeling surveilled. So that's not a good relationship to have with your users. And so many people have switched from, Windows 10, instead of going to Windows 11, they're going to Linux or other operating systems. That's fine. Those operating systems work perfectly well. I run them here. And I think that's what Microsoft is going to see as their punishment. They're going to lose some market share from this, not only in the Windows ecosystem, but also on their cloud ecosystem. Because if you're not using Microsoft Windows, using their cloud, really, not using the cloud seems like a natural next step. And I think many people are going to be taking that. So in the PC vendors, including Dell and some of the others out there, they felt whiplash. They built their systems to Copilot expectations, and narratives shifted. In other words, people didn't like it, and suddenly they're holding the bag. They're, kind of forced into promoting the Microsoft ecosystem because they're selling it as part of the hardware platforms that they're selling. Dell, obviously the big one out there. And the PC makers invested heavily in AI PC Copilot, PC positioning requirements, but reporting argues Microsoft's changing emphasis made that investment feel less durable and creating an OEM frustration and weakening the ecosystem's enthusiasm. So they felt the pressure. In other words, people were forced to upgrade. And if they're forced to upgrade, obviously they're going to make more money. But if everybody's complaining about the upgrade or everybody's moving in a different direction because of it, that's not necessarily going to help them at all. In other words, if they have a bunch of angry users, even if they see a bump in revenue because people are being forced to upgrade their systems to move to Windows 11, people are going to figure out how to get off those systems. They're going to figure out, other alternatives out there and what they're able to do. And even large corporate clients that, buy tens of thousands of systems, each year in leasing arrangements or purchase arrangements. So that's going to hit them on their bottom line. People are running to the Apple ecosystem. People are running to the Linux ecosystem. There's alternatives out there and they're pretty good. And people, now that they understand them, once I think they switch to some of these alternatives, they're not going to be going back to Windows. And I think the PC sellers saw that. And the OEM frustration and misunderstanding and co-marketing with Microsoft just kind of blew up in their face. So, and here we are today. As recent a few days ago, Microsoft started course correcting, pulling back and reevaluating parts of the Windows AI push. And the reporting says Microsoft has been considering reducing Copilot integrations in Windows 11 and rethinking things related to AI directions and implicit acknowledgement that earlier approach created too much pushback. Yeah, duh. And this is one thing I think that technology providers have a tendency to do a lot. They have confirmation bias. They decide to go in one direction. Everybody gets on board. They cheerlead about that. It's all internal, and they're pushing billions of dollars into making this stuff work, and without understanding or have a perception in terms of empathy for people who are going to use it. So no one really kind of asked the question, should we? They kind of ask, can we? And of course you can. You can integrate LLMs, fairly easy to do that, into any kind of a product. That's why we see it everywhere. And it's not just, ChatGPT, but, Gemini and, all the other LLMs that are out there. And just because we can do it doesn't mean we should. I don't think Microsoft asked the should part. And so they got way over their skis in terms of what they thought this technology would bring. Back in 2023, when I'm sure they were first thinking of it, they would, get in a big circle and talk about how smart they were because this was the age of generative AI. 2022 is when ChatGPT launched. And this felt like a right answer for them. In other words, to make a change without considering how the users would respond to it. And you see this a lot. You see this in the world of cloud. You see this in the world of AI, especially in the last few years, where everybody just gets very excited about the core capabilities and adding it to their system because it's so easy to do. Adding an LLM-based, chat system or agentic-based capabilities, things like that, is so easy because we have great tools out there to make it happen. But no one asks the question, should we do it? And the reality is they shouldn't have done it. I think that they should have decoupled, their AI, whether it's called Copilot or whatever, from their core productivity tools, and people could choose it and they could, set a parameter where it could be used, but don't charge them extra money for it because it's not costing you a lot of money. And also be able to show permissions and have, open and transparency in terms of how you're handling information, what's being sent to the backend systems, what's not, and have people's ability to stop that, to basically set the parameters so that's not going to happen. They didn't think through any of that. And people are very picky in terms of using technology now. And people are a lot more technically savvy than they were just a few years ago. And so if you do that, they're going to respond poorly to it. Whether, someone's a, techno nerd or, just a casual user. And everybody felt betrayed by this. And I think it's going to take a few years before Microsoft, probably 5 years before Microsoft gets trust back, or maybe they never do. So we'll see how they respond to this. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments, whether you agree with me or not, and whether or not you're ditching some of the Microsoft tools and operating systems for other paths because of Copilot or any other reason. Anyway, don't forget to like and subscribe and check out my other videos on this channel. Also check out my InfoWorld Cloud Computing blog, my 100+ LinkedIn learning courses, and of course my generative AI architecture course out on Go Cloud Careers. And finally, my latest books, Unlocking the Power of Cloud and An Insider's Guide to Cloud Computing. So until next week, stay very, very safe. The magical YouTube algorithm thinks this is another one of my videos that you should watch next. Stay safe, guys.